Jingawala. My name is Arabella and I'm here today on 101.3 FM for Tales of the Tweed. I'm a First Nations woman, a local Minyambul woman, and last week we began a series which I'm going to explore over the month of February about Aboriginal seasons. Last week I spoke about the season of Bamtu. Bamtu is the seasons of bloodwood, and if you're observant at the moment you'll see lots of bloodwood in the area, which are a very unique tree. They've got a kind of really interesting gum and gum veins through them that it's kind of really red and pink. You have flowers that kind of are full that you'll see along the edges of the river, for example, or through Cabarita, Kingscliff, all of those areas. They have come in like a really gorgeous yellowy cream or a dark pink. They have a very pale sap as well, as their veins are like dark and blood in colour. That's where the name comes from. But they're really like a native teak. They're significant to this area for a number of reasons. You find them in dry siluriferal forests or on the edges of wet siluriferal forests. But of course, they're really the indicator of as we move into summer and go into autumn. So when you see the falling of the Bamtu, when they start to minimise and the sap starts to change, like at the moment it's hot, so there'll be lots of sap, there'll be lots of activity around the tree. As that diminishes, we will then go into our season of Yaga, which doesn't happen until the full moon in March. But that's the change of season into what we know in the Aboriginal calendar as pre-winter. And it becomes the season. Yaga is the Minyambul word for wind. So you'll notice as the season shifts in the end of March that you start to have those really strong cool winds, and that's your first indication that we're about to move into winter, or the season of Warrigan. So Bamtu I'm going to focus on a little bit at the moment today so that people get the opportunity to observe it this week, next week and the next few weeks, and observe that tree and see how it changes as we get to the pre-winter season. It's a good indicator because it's kind of going to be like a living clock. If you're driving around the area and you see it, you'll then start to be conscious of it, and you'll see it flower, which is in full flower at the moment. It will continue to flower. The sap will change on the tree as well within the next few weeks, and then it will minimise and move into a pre-winter phase, and you'll see less of those flowers and then more of, we actually have winter flowers in the Tweed as well that bloom, lots of shrubs and things that bloom in the winter period, and you'll start to observe those more. So I am going to have a little bit every week on what the season is so that you get in step with the season. And for those of you that are old enough to remember, the seasons of the Tweed, because it was a regional community, so a growing and farming community, was also in step with lunar calendars and seasons in a different way. We just had what Chinese people call Chinese New Year, but in the indigenous calendar we also follow the moon. And the reason that we follow the moon, there are two reasons. One is, if you don't know, the southern hemisphere has the most water in the world. We have about 20% more water than the northern hemisphere. And the other aspect, of course, is that we're a coastal and river community, which means that we're heavily impacted by the way the tides move and waters move. And if that's the basis of your environment, then you're going to become very good at reading lunar cycles and lunar calendars, because they in fact impact the waterways heavily. So on the 2nd of February, on the new Chinese New Year, it was actually the beginning of 2022, so it was actually the start of the Bamtu season. So on the new moon, which was the other night, for those that were out fishing, you would have seen an extraordinarily high tide on the new moon. And of course, this season is all about worms and mollusks that live in the river edges as well. So that affects things for people who are fishermen, like whiting, flathead. You're going to see an abundance of that in the Bamtu season, which is really nice, because what's actually occurring is it's stimulating all the river systems. So we went through a new moon cycle that just began up until the full moon on the 17th. It's a really active time in the waterways. So if you wanted to educate your children about how the tide is affected by the moon, you should in fact take them down to the rivers to see a new moon river and a full moon river, and they can observe the difference differences and they'll see the different activity, which is another way to kind of manage your environment and read your environment. But the Tweed used to have many years ago, and I don't know, we were just discussing it in the studio, what happened to the banana festival. We used to follow systems, even colonisers that came into the area followed farming rhythms and farming patterns and then celebrated that abundance. Traditionally, Aboriginal people used to have really large moon ceremonies. There's amazing literature and information that you can find if you have Google Scholar, so that's like Google, but it's an academic resource, Google Scholar, and you put in Aboriginal people and lunar festivals or moon festivals, it will give you some documented information about the early observations in the 1800s of large Aboriginal families and mobs coming together, sharing in the abundance. So that would be like having a banana festival. Of course, there weren't bananas, but it would have been celebrating other foods and really kind of coming together to organise and share food in that abundance and pay reverence to the abundance of food that's available. So the idea of celebrating food or being in sync with a lunar calendar for food and abundance of food is not just unique to First Nations people. It's actually unique to those societies and civilizations that had intimate relationships with land. The calendar that we have currently, the 12 months, is really a construct that was taken by both the Gregorian and the Julian calendar, and it really has no purpose other than political and a religious purpose of time. But what that means is it's superfluous or it's superficial to how land and seasons and waters and birds and bees and animals all exist. So if you need to eat, and we do need to eat from our land, we do need to eat the resources from our land and drink the water in our land, it's probably wise to get in tune with a environmental calendar or an Aboriginal calendar that keeps time in a different way so that you can plan your food differently, you can read the seasons differently, and you actually become more intimate with your own environment. Southern Hemisphere people should be all over a lunar calendar. That's why you see it a lot in Asia, Thailand, China, because we have a lot of water in this part of the planet. So we actually have more water than the northern part. So that's why we're more sensitive to it. So for those that would like to explore more about Aboriginal people and lunar festivals or moon festivals, please have a look at Google Scholar, or you can jump online to currycountry.com there and join our education circle where we share resources and talk more about how Aboriginal lens and viewpoints are constructed and what the principles and the philosophies are. But for those that have grown up in the region and are very familiar with regional activities, they would be aware that they also celebrated an abundance of food cycles growing up, and it's no different. So I'm just asking you to consider that we're in Bamtu, seasons of bloodwood. That's one of your first indicators this year, to watch that tree as it moves throughout the year. And then we'll go into Yaga next week, which is known as the pre-winter. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about winds and clouds and how they differ and the language around that. That's my series for today, Wednesday morning. I'm here with you every Wednesday. The show is Tales of the Tweed. I'm a First Nations woman. If you wanted more information, you can find www.currycountry.com. I'm happy to answer any questions if people also want to ask questions. Very happy to share resources or information. And I'm looking forward to speaking to you next week. Bugubeh.